Hello, church. I am very excited to jump into Isaiah chapter 43 and 44 with you. Let's just jump right in here. What I want us to see in chapter 43 is I want to focus on verses 16 to about 20 and then verse 25. And what I want us to do here is recognize there are a growing number, it feels like, of Bible teachers in the world today, many of which you can find on the internet, even some here maybe locally, that are starting to get this idea, and they are using a term that says we should unhitch from the Old Testament because we don't need it anymore. It's not relevant. Jesus has fulfilled all the Old Testament, and so all we need to do is focus on the new. What I want us to see is a verse in verse 18 of chapter 43. This is a verse that sometimes you could quote, and if you just simply took that verse out of context, you could say, oh, well, that actually sounds pretty logical. What do we need the Old Testament for when God has done a new thing? And I want to illustrate that by a very quick little short story. Okay, there are many scriptures I could use to prove this point, but I thought maybe a real quick short story might be in order to help illustrate this point for us to understand. Okay, let's just say that you and your spouse have dreamed about going on a 10th anniversary vacation for all your lives, and you have fallen on exceptionally hard times to the point where as that day approaches, you realize it's never going to happen. There's too much financial pressure. And out of the blue, somebody comes to you and says to you, I'm going to give you an all expenses paid up to $10,000 trip to go anywhere you want for a week. And you are ecstatic. You think to yourself, oh, the Lord has answered our prayers. He has graciously blessed us. And off you go and have this amazing trip. You come back, and what's the natural outcome? You are going to spend many moments reminiscing together about how wonderful the trip was. And even though you are not sure if anything ever that good will come into your lives again, man, it is just so much fun to think about how good the time was together. But then that same person, as your 25th anniversary approaches, and you again still realize there's no way we can celebrate anything, but good thing we had that 10th anniversary trip. He comes to you, the same guy, and says, you know what? I want you to forget about that old trip. I have already talked to your boss. He's given you a month off. Here's $1 million. Go celebrate your 25th anniversary together. What your mind is blown, and you would think to yourself, what in the world is up with this guy? You go off and you enjoy this month together, and that to a degree is what God has done here in a very incomplete way, but that's a little bit what we're talking about here. You would have no trouble now focusing on this new trip that you've taken while still remembering, man, the old one was good, and what we thought could never be topped, God has infinitely now blessed us with more. And that's what God is talking about here. If you look at verses 16 to 17, God himself talks about some of the things that he has done in the Old Testament, things that were amazing and that at the time were totally miraculous. And we don't want to take away from that. But in comparison to what God has done in the Old Testament, church, with Jesus coming and perfectly reconciling us with God, that we can now walk in unity with him, in relationship with him. In comparison, what Jesus has done is far greater, infinitely greater than what God did in the Old Testament. And that's what God is saying here. So church, don't get deceived into thinking the Old Testament is no longer relevant. We read verses like this and we say, oh, I guess we don't have to listen to that. We can unhitch, if you will. No, God is simply saying, I did some great things, but focus on the amazing things that I've got coming for you yet. And so we could ask ourselves this question, church. Lord, have I ever been tempted to minimize the Old Testament because of what you did in the new? Good question to ask the Lord this morning. And then I want to go in chapter 44. A few weeks ago, we talked about idols and how they are subjective in our lives and how we need to seek the Holy Spirit on helping us identify those things in our lives. And this chapter, maybe more accurately and clearly than any in the Bible, very, very clearly helps us identify what idols are. And there's a few verses I want to quickly draw out that help us to see what these things could be. First is in verse 10. It says, who shapes a god and casts an idol which can profit him nothing? Church, the first lesson that we got to learn about idols is that we only build idols in our lives that give us something that we want, that God doesn't. All right? So if an example of this clearly is in Exodus chapter 32, when the Israelites build the golden calf. They know that they're supposed to worship God, which is why they name that golden calf Yahweh. But what do as soon as they've got that thing built? They rose up to play. In other words, they committed sexual sin that was not God's will for them, but that they wanted to do. And so they ended up building an idol that gave them that, and so they were able to do the pleasures they wanted apart from God's will. So that's the first principle of idols. They give us what we want apart from God's will. The second thing we want to see is in verse 18. What we got to recognize here is that people that worship idols know nothing, understand nothing. Their minds are closed and they cannot understand. That is harsh language, church. And it scares me when I apply that to my own life, realizing that in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, it says that the God of this age has blinded people so that they cannot see those things. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 18 to 22, it would even go so far as to say that there are actually demonic forces behind idols that are at work when idols are worshipped. Church, idols are nothing to mess around with. We need to deal with them because behind those idols are things that demons are trying to take and steal into our lives and destroy us, just like John 10:10 says. What we got to see thirdly is that in verse 20, we can see at the end of verse 20 what it says. Is not this idol in my right hand a lie? Church, the basic lie that all idols have in common is this, that there is something good for us apart from God's will. And that is why idols can be such ensnaring things to get rid of, because it is actually what we need to face is we need to get rid of those things in our lives that bring us pleasure that are apart from God's will. And church, it's a lie. It is a lie because we believe then that there is something in God's will that is not good for us. And that's what we need to confess. Church, allow the Holy Spirit today to search your heart afresh for idols and sin that may remain. Ask him to reveal those things to you. Ask him to reveal the lie that you have believed about that idol. And then ask him to restore you in truth, to believe that all he has for you is good.